let's bring in a constitutional law expert on this. Robert Tsai is exactly that. He's a professor at American University's Washington College of Law. Robert, you've been on here before. Plain and simple here, your interpretation of the Constitution, is Mueller right or is Barr right? Essentially, Barr is saying, by making the decision not to bring charges, Barr is saying that Mueller could have brought an obstruction charge if he had wanted to, if you were to take them both at face value at what they said. What say you?
Well, I think on the question of the constitutionality of indicting a sitting president, it's really an open question. The Constitution itself doesn't give us a very clear answer, and very well-respected academics as well as lawyers have taken opposing positions on this. What Robert Mueller has done is to just take for granted OLC's position, which has been a consistent one, both in 1973 and 2000. They issued memos saying just that a sitting president can't be, as a matter of constitutional law, be indicted while he's in office.
Were you surprised to hear Robert Mueller say even a sealed indictment?
Well, I'm not surprised, because I think that's consistent with the OLC memos as written, and that's because there's first a concern about the textually given powers of a president being interfered with. The question is how can a president carry out his responsibilities to nation while something like that is going on? And if you indict the president and hide it, there's still a risk that something like that will leak out and then hang over a sitting president.
Robert Mueller doing what he did today, he didn't have to do that. He could have issued a statement. He could have done it a lot of ways. Do you see it? Should it be viewed that he was sending a message to Congress?
I think he was. I think he wanted to clear the air. I think that he did feel that AG Barr's initial presentation of his investigation's work was highly misleading. We saw that from the letters, the correspondence that was.
Is there anything illegal about being misleading?
I don't think there is.
I mean,
no, there isn't.
I mean, I know a lot of people are going to say,
right.
Like, he legally can mislead.
Right. He can mislead. He can spin the investigation. The only accountability would be a political one, unless he lied under oath.
Right. Which is why I checked the congressional testimony to see how he characterized things there versus there, and he seemed to be careful on that. Is this a regulation that now gets rewritten yet again? I mean, it seems like every time we've run up into this issue, everybody realizes, well, that's not quite right. That wasn't probably the intent. Where should this go from here? Where does this debate go from here?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's going to be much of a movement to rewrite the regulations. I think certainly the movement to protect the president and streamline these procedures, I think the people who were invested in that project are fairly happy with how things have gone. I think that on the question of whether you can indict a sitting president, that question is an open one. And one thing I would point out is that historically, it's interesting to note that the DOJ has taken opposing positions from the last couple of independent or special counsels, right? That both Ken Starr and the Watergate independent counsel took the view that you could indict a sitting president. So this is a question that remains unanswered.
Robert Tsai, then I'll have to leave it there, and we'll have to take your class at AU. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.